questions to the Minister for Justice. We'll move to leaders' questions. So, under Standing Order 38, I call on Deputy Doherty.
Jaskin Corlia, Ara for Martinier, Gur Shalu Litraha Giavile Yahed, a Gachaska, Chila, Ween Scaniel Tobash, Modula, Bridgie, and Croman Yanni. August at Tushmori Gofol, Faraga, now will annulus a hortifo and realtis na on the hospital. Minister, yesterday we learned the scope and scale of the devastating hip surgery scandal. 2,260 families have been sent letters. I raised this issue here in Leaders' Questions in March, 2 months ago. I called on the government to get ahead of it. I told you and asked you to tell parents what was going on, but parents are still being kept in the dark, even today. And what does it say about your government that facing into this scandal, it took 2 months for you to even ask CHI how many children were affected, how many letters have been issued? The Taoiseach this week was still trying to downplay these letters, suggesting they were issued to reassure parents on the back of a media leak of the draft report. That is nonsense, Minister. These letters were sent out to implement an early recommendation of the draft audit. The recommendation calls for the recall of all these children for follow-up. And why? Why is the CHI implementing an early recommendation of the draft audit? Because the draft audit is shocking, it is devastating, it is damning. The draft audit states that 60% of surgeries in one hospital and 80% of surgeries in another hospital were unnecessary. Now just let that sink in. Let it sink in for a moment what that means. Children as young as 1 have had their hips opened up, cutting into their bones. They've had to learn how to walk again. They've been left with scars for their life. And now to find out that these surgeries may have been unnecessary. Imagine having to bring your 2-year-old little girl into that operating theatre, having to leave her in the hands of the system, only to find out that the surgery, the pain, the learning how to walk again, that scar that she has on her hip was now never ever necessary. The surgery didn't need to happen. Because that's the experience of so many parents out there. It's the experience of one mother who I spoke to this morning. In 2015, she brought her little girl, 2 years of age, for surgery on her right hip. It was the only hip that was ever mentioned in all of the assessments. After the operation, she was told that she needed surgery on the other hip as well. She described feeling like a rabbit in the headlights, but like any parent would, she followed the medical advice. And after 5 weeks, her daughter had the second operation. Now, this letter dropped in her letterbox 7 weeks ago. She was immediately concerned. She sent 30 emails over a period of 5 weeks to CHI without one response. Only when she got her solicitor involved did she get a response. She sought a second medical opinion. She is now sure, Minister, that the first hip operation at best was premature and the second operation wasn't needed at all. At all. She is frustrated at the lack of answers from CHI and from the government in relation to this. And this isn't an isolated case. Every family I've spoken to over the last 2 months are looking for one thing more than anything else. They want to know if the surgery that was carried out in their child was necessary or not. And the audit is not going to give them that answer. The audit is an anonymised study. It won't give them the individual answer. You're asking parents to wait. You're asking parents to trust the process, but trust has completely broken down. So I have a simple question for your government here today, and it's on behalf of parents that have contacted me, Deputy Culnan, Deputy Carthy, and many others in our party and across the benches. Can you tell me that every single one of those 2,260 anxious families, that every one of their children will have access to an independent clinical assessment that will answer the simple question for them whether their child was operated on necessarily or unnecessarily? And when will they be given access to that clinical assessment? Minister, I asked you 2 months ago to get ahead of this. It is not fair that we've left families in this situation for that period of time.
Thank you, and ask Ken Corley, and thank you, Deputy, for raising this matter. I think we agree on a number of things here. I think we are all working on behalf of the children that you've mentioned. We are all working to make sure that we get answers to what's happened here. And we've discussed this a number of times in the chamber here. We are all extremely concerned at the thoughts even of a child having a surgery where that was not necessary. I think we can probably all point to somebody we know or somebody who has come to us where they've either been recommended the surgery and haven't gone through with it, where they've been recommended it, they've gone through with it, it hasn't been needed, or indeed where they've needed the surgery. And what we need to get to the bottom of is, where have surgeries been conducted on children, been provided where it wasn't needed, where has injury been inflicted on young people where it simply wasn't needed. And the most important thing that we need to ascertain at the outset is the facts, and that's why this review is taking place. And I appreciate we all want to know the facts as quickly as possible, but we don't have those yet. And I know you're pointing to and making reference to parts of the report. The report hasn't been published. The Minister hasn't seen the report, and while it's been very clear to her that she will have the report in the coming weeks, we don't yet have the absolute facts of the review that's taking place. So I think we all have responsibility in this chamber to make sure that what we're speaking to and what we're talking about, it's based on facts and reports that are published. Secondly, it's important to make sure and to assure families at the moment where there are surgeries taking place, because we know that there are children that do need surgery today, that there are revised procedures that have been put in place, there are new protocols in place where all surgeries are being assessed by a multidisciplinary team before any decision is being taken. But there's also separate work being done, and that will follow through from the review to make sure that absolute best practice, that up-to-date practice that's in place in other countries and that should be in place here, that is adhered to if any child is being put forward for these potential surgeries. In terms of the overall numbers, and again I think we have to be very careful here, the figure of just over 2,200 young people is not a figure that is suggesting every single one of those young people had surgeries where they shouldn't have had them. And we have to be clear about that. It's important that these families have been written out to. It's important that they have been engaged with by CHI, but also by CAPA. We know that 1,700 of these were with CHI, 500 of them were with CAPA, that they've been engaged with, and where there hasn't been follow-on in these instances, that now begins. I know for a lot of these families where surgeries have taken place, they have had follow-on, they have had engagement, they have had consultation with their consultants, with their teams, and those who haven't, there's a very clear commitment that that engagement and that consultation would happen immediately. So the most important thing here, as you said at the outset, Deputy, is that we ascertain the facts. What has happened here? What practices were followed? How many children were impacted? What do we need to do now? And above all, and to your point, how do we make sure that any follow-on support, any medical support, any assistance that's needed by those families and those children, that is provided immediately? But we have to get to the bottom of this and the facts, and we will have those. We don't have that yet. We don't have that report. We do know that the initial recommendation, as was published by the CHI in their statement this week, is the reason that they have sent out the letters to families to make sure that that engagement starts immediately, that we're not just waiting on the report, but we do need to have those facts and that information to make sure that any practice moving forward ensures that this doesn't happen again, and that above all our children, who we expect when we go into our hospitals, when we're given advice and medical advice, that we can stand by that and that we know the best practice has been applied in every single case possible. Thank you.
With respect, that's not good enough. The fact is that 2,260 letters were issued. The fact is the letters were issued as part of the implementation of a recommendation of the audit, the draft audit. The fact is the draft audit said that all of those children should be recalled. The fact is there's 2,260 families out there that are anxious, that are worried. The fact is none of those families know whether their child was operated or not. The fact is your government has no plan at this point in time to provide a pathway that will allow them to determine if that is the case. The audit is not going to tell them that. I asked you 2 months ago to get ahead of this. I pleaded with you, and we've given countless examples of families who are no longer waiting for government. They're seeking the second opinion. They've gone to America. They're going to London. They're putting their hands in their own pocket because government are giving them no answer. The fact is, this parent that I talked to this morning sent 30 letters without a response looking for information. Minister, you need to deal with this. I know every single person in this chamber would be appalled at the idea of a young girl being opened up, her bone being chiselled into, unnecessary, left with a scar, that pain. But it is your responsibility of government to provide a pathway, to provide certainty for those families. I ask you a simple question. Will you ensure that every single one of the 2,260 families that got that letter will be given an independent clinical pathway to determine whether their child was operated on unnecessary or not? Minister? That's the first question they want answered.
Deputy, I can't be any clearer with you on this. we firstly need to ascertain the facts. We need to make sure that we have absolute clarity as to what has happened, how many people are involved here, and how do we make sure this never happens again. At the same time, we need to make sure that where families need follow-on care, where they need further information, where they need further clinical support, that is provided. And I think the Minister for Health couldn't be any clearer in the commentary that she has made over the last number of months. Any support that families need, any support that children need, going as far back as 2010, and obviously 2010 was chosen because 15 years is the skeletal reference age of which a child matures and their bone density. So that's the parameters of which have been chosen. Any child within that time frame will be provided with the support, and their families as well. That's why those letters were written out initially. Many of those families will have had continued engagement. Many of those families where surgeries happened years ago will have been engaging with their teams, will have had that support. But for those who haven't, and I accept that there are those who might not have, who don't know whether the operation should have happened or not, we need to make sure that we find that information as quickly as possible. And of course, there is, without a shadow of a doubt, no question as to the fact that they will get the support, the assistance, the medical support that they need if this has not been done correctly.
Deputy Cian O'Callaghan.
Margaret. Minister, the Government has repeatedly stated that it doesn't want to see a drip feed of information about the audit of hip surgeries at the 3 children's hospitals, but that is what we are getting. Any information about this scandal has had to be dragged out of this Government. Yesterday, responding to me, the Taoiseach confirmed for the first time that he expects the audit to be finalised next week. Why did it take so long to provide this basic piece of information which families have been spending months trying to get? It also took until yesterday to reveal that more than 2,200 families have now received letters as a result of the audit. On Tuesday, the Taoiseach didn't even know the correct reason those letters had been sent. Minister, unnecessary and painful surgery on young children is absolutely horrific. The impacts of these surgeries can be hugely traumatic. Families are utterly devastated to find out that this has happened to their child. Parents who have contacted me do not know where to go to get their questions answered. At the very least, the Government must address this now. Minister, the lack of basic information, the level of inaccurate information and the drip feed of information coming from Government is not acceptable. Why is the Government keeping families in the dark until the final audit is published? Minister, on foot of the draft audit, a number of measures have already been taken. More than 2,200 letters have been sent out to families. A multidisciplinary team of clinicians is already reviewing cases, and an action plan has been put in place. So a lot of things are happening in the background, but what we are not getting is upfront or complete information about it. And this is causing huge distress for families who are desperate for information. Minister, the entire process has been dealt with shambolically by the Government. Families have been left in the dark, and this needs to end now. Minister, the Taoiseach told me yesterday he expects the audit to be finalised by the end of next week. Does this mean parents will have it in their hands next week? What day will they receive it? Can you outline the full list of recommendations that have already been put into place at Children's Health Ireland and CAPA as a result of the audit? And will the Minister for Health answer questions next week in the Dáil when the audit is finalised? And can you give me a commitment on that, Minister?
Thank you, Deputy. I don't think it's helpful for any of us to be discussing certain parts and certain elements without having the full facts. And I appreciate fully and agree with you that families want all of the facts, they want the information, and they don't want it piecemeal. They certainly don't want parts of an unpublished document being published elsewhere, not coming through the Minister, not having that direct engagement, be it with the Minister, with CHI, or with the other hospitals involved here. So the most important thing is that we can have this review completed, and yes, the information provided to me is that the Minister has been told she will have this next week. I don't have the exact day, but obviously next week, as soon as the Minister has it, as soon as she is able to engage with the families first and foremost, she will do that. She's only recently spent quite a number of hours in the Dáil, I think, answering questions, not just on this, but many other issues as well. So there's never been any doubt that the Minister does not want to engage, does not want to talk to families or indeed discuss this here in the Chamber. To go back to the basic facts here, as we have all outlined, there's not a single one of us here could even comprehend what it's like for a family to believe that their child, or to know that their child has had a surgery that they didn't need. As a mother of 2 young children, the very thoughts are terrifying, and I apply that, I think, to anybody who has children, grandchildren, nieces, nephews. So we all want to make sure we get to the bottom of this, that those who need any further clinical help or assistance, that they get that, but that above all, practices that have to change, that they change. And that's what's happening already. So while we need to ascertain the facts for the families involved here, that doesn't prevent us from starting work in looking at why were these practices carried out? How do we make sure any surgeries happening at the moment, that they're not applying the same practices? And we know that change is taking place already. So any surgeries at the moment, there is a multidisciplinary team that sits down, that looks at the cases and then decides whether to go forward or not. So that's really important progress that's been made. In terms of the letters, I mean, it's really important that families have communication throughout all of this. While there is piecemeal information being put out there, and it was the Minister, my understanding, that asked for the correct figure to be put out there because it was increasing and decreasing and escalating. We now have that figure because it was asked to be put into the public domain. So that did alleviate some of the concerns around the increasing numbers overall. We have established helplines or email addresses for patients to ask queries. Just to read them out, you have ceo@childrenshealthireland.ie and Kappa Kids Inquiries at nohc.ie. These are dedicated email addresses that have been put in place for families to be able to communicate separate to the letters that they have received, which very clearly state if you haven't had engagement from your hospital, if you haven't had follow-up, if you haven't had that sort of engagement, be it in the last year or 15 years, we are going to engage with you and reach out to you. So there are a number of strands here, Deputy, and I appreciate that. It would be better if everything was happening at once. The review is looking at exactly what has happened here. Separately, we've given an element of information, or CHI has, to be able to engage with those families, just to make that communication at the very outset, as set out, is best practice. And thirdly then, work is already underway in our hospitals to make sure that anything that's happening now, any procedures that are in place, that the same practice wasn't being applied here. But of course, once this report is received, first thing the Minister will do is reach out to the families and make sure that she can engage with them on the facts and the information as she has them.
Deputy Callanan.
Minister, for parents and for families not to have information now that they're seeking is hugely distressing for them. It's the very least that they deserve and that they expect. And we know from some of the information that has been drip-fed that some of the recommendations in the draft audit are being implemented. We know that at this stage. So why can't you share with us all of the recommendations in that draft audit? You're already working on implementing a number of them. Parents have found that out. We know that. So why not share all of them with us? Why withhold that at this stage when the government is working away on implementing recommendations, and yet you won't share with us and the families what those recommendations are? So I'm just asking you now, will you now share those recommendations that the government is working away on with the families and with the public?
Deputy, I can't be any clearer on this. The Minister does not have the report. She does not have recommendations. While elements have been published, and I would say unhelpfully published in online articles, the report has not been presented to the Minister. I think it stands to reason, while this work has been done, the hospital is not going to sit still and say, well, we'll wait for everything. They know that they need to change their practices. That's why they've put new multidisciplinary teams in place. They know that it's important to write out and to engage with the families as they've identified them, because those figures have been put out intentionally into the public domain to try and alleviate any concerns that they're escalating beyond anything that we would have thought. And that work is underway at the moment. But in terms of a concrete set of recommendations, it is simply not the case that the Minister has them, is working on them and won't tell anybody. The report has not been finalised and presented to the Minister, but once it has been, the Minister will first and foremost engage with families, she'll engage with Kappa, with CHI, and of course will engage with the Dáil to see what do we need to do now, what are the next steps, and certainly where there are recommendations and changes that need to be made in our hospitals in terms of procedures, in terms of patient and client engagement, that they can proceed and that they can start immediately.
Thank you, Minister. Deputy Roderic O'Gorman.
Thank you, Lascian Corla. Minister, I want to draw your attention to comments made in the last fortnight by the Minister of State for Forestry, Farm Safety and Horticulture, Minister Michael Healy-Rae, as it's really one of the first opportunities we've had to get an insight into this government's thinking on climate and nature. Minister Healy-Rae told the Seanad during statements on forestry on the 29th of April, and I quote, I and my officials in the department will look at planting more peatland. Farmers want to plant peatland. Farmers do not want to plant their green ground because they have worked so hard to get the bit they have. They broke their backs and bones to make the land green. They do not want to plant trees on it, but instead use it for grazing. We want to use green ground for grazing, but plant trees on rough ground and peaty ground. I'm afraid this is just one of these things on which we cannot always agree. Minister, this wasn't a throwaway remark. Minister Healy-Rae came back to the topic again and he reiterated the point. And it's clear he strongly believes that A, we must only encourage afforestation for export, and B, land not in service of agriculture can be directed towards this, and that somehow this would be better for the environment. And it's also clear that he's leading officials in his department to develop a new policy that implements this view. And just to be crystal clear for the record, a policy of planting on peatlands that we have spent years trying to restore, trying to preserve, this policy would be environmental madness. Aside from it being in breach of EU law and indeed of Irish policy, it would destroy an extremely delicate and extremely complex habitat that can provide a large and effective part of Ireland's capacity to store carbon. And all of this in order to develop cheap, quickly grown timber. UCD climate scientist and lecturer Florence Reynolds-Wilson said, planting on peat is, and I quote again, just not a viable option for climate, for nature restoration, for anything. Peat is a huge carbon store, a much, much better permanent carbon store than temporary forestry. Peatlands need to be wet to keep that carbon in. Minister, can you please confirm if it is the policy of the new government to ignore science, to abandon our legal obligations and to destroy some of our best chances to capture carbon while preserving unique habitats? Has the Minister for State instructed his officials to begin implementing a new forestry plan to include the planting on peatlands? And if not, why is the Minister for State going around telling people this is what he's done?
Minister.
Thank you, Deputy. I think it's clear in order to meet the 18% forest target that's set out in our National Forest Strategy, we have a huge amount of work to do. We need to plant an additional 500,000 acres. Therefore, it is important that we continue to examine all of our lands, that we invest in research and that we make the best decisions possible. A huge amount of work has already happened and is already underway in terms of our overall forestry targets and our overall approach. The most important thing, and maybe just to outline some of that progress, we have a new forestry programme from 23 to 27, approved by the government on the 6th of September 23, funded with €1.3 billion, of course, which you were a part of. The programme provides unprecedented incentives to encourage the planting of trees, as well as a range of measures to support owners of existing forests to manage their forests sustainably, forest creation measures, including native woodland expansion and planting of small native trees areas. We have a comprehensive package of measures, including the programme introduced an increase in forestry premiums of between 46 and 66%, and farmers will now receive 20 years of premium payments compared to 15 years for non-farmers. We also have forestry licensing, which is a complex process due to the requirements set to take account of environmental requirements, again set out in both national and EU law. All of these measures within the programme are measures that will continue, measures that were supported by you and indeed the previous government. Anything that we do, Deputy, in this regard, anything that we do has to be backed by science and informed by science. That won't change, that's not going to change, that's the approach that we have taken by the very outset, and it is for those reasons that we've started to see significant progress in terms of climate. I mean, it is one of the most pressing challenges for our society. It is already causing an increased occurrence, whether it's extreme weather events, whether it's storms, whether it's flooding. We only have to look to Storm Iowan recently, we only have to look to what were once disappearing lakes in Roscommon and the Midlands that are now permanent, and the impact that it's having on homes. So we have to take action, we have to address the root causes, while at the same time making sure that we put in place and prepare for the impacts of climate change. And it's working. I'm not saying it's working at the rate and the speed we want it to, but it is certainly working. If we look at our emissions, the most recent inventory report from July of 24 shows a decrease of 6.8% in Ireland's greenhouse gas emissions in 23. This is compared to 22, where we saw a 1.9% reduction in the previous year. If we look then again for the year coming, again it's reducing further. Where have we seen that reduction? 21.6% in electricity, 5.8% in industry, 4.6% in agriculture, where we are making progress, as well as 7 7.1% in residential. This is all because of the interconnection, the increased renewable energy capacity, the reduced nitrogen fertiliser use in agriculture, less fossil fuels in our home, and all of this at a time where last year alone we saw a 5% increase in our overall economy. Our economy is growing, and yet we're still managing to reduce our overall emissions. So the work that has been done, the measures that have been put in place in the previous government, of which we worked collectively together, but also started by Richard Bruton when he was Minister for Climate in 2019, the first all-of-government climate strategy. It's all of this work collectively together, backed by science, adhering to science, following science, that has brought about these changes. Do we need to do more? Absolutely, and that's exactly what we will do.
Deputy O'Gorman.
Minister, I appreciate your comments, but we're still left with the words of the line Minister for Forestry. And again, it's worth quoting what he told the Seanad. This is why I and my officials in the department will be looking at planting more peatlands. So is the Minister being allowed to indulge in a bit of Trump light, be anti-science, be anti-climate, while at the same time purporting to speak for the people? Instead of drill, baby, drill, it's dig, drain and destroy. Minister, who's actually in charge of the policy here? And if you're not able to set that out, can you ask your colleague, the Senior Minister for Agriculture, and indeed Minister Healy-Rae himself, to come before this House and explain if government policy has changed and if it is now the policy to allow the destruction of our upland bogs?
Sir.
If we're to achieve our overall targets, and we've set very clearly in law that we would achieve our overall targets, we need to take a number of measures. And I've mentioned just some of the ways in which we've seen reductions, be it in energy, be it in agriculture overall, which includes our forestry targets, focusing on our environment or our economy overall, as well as our transport and our private sector. The critical thing is that whatever we do, and again I'll repeat this, whether it's agriculture, whether it's forestry or plantation, it has to be backed by science. We know that obviously there are certain permits of planting on shallower peat soil, so less than 30 centimetres deep. Again, where it's permitted, where it's possible and where it follows the science, we have to explore all avenues here. We do have a huge amount of work to do in planting 500,000 acres to be able to meet that 18% target, but there are other areas in which we need to make progress as well. We know that on any given day, and in fairness, we've made a huge amount of progress. I think last March, at a certain given time, over 50% of our energy was coming from renewable energy. We have a target of 80%. We need to do more to make sure that we can reach that target of 80%. Otherwise, we are at a risk of energy security and challenges that come with that as well. So this is across a number of different avenues. Our farmers, our business people, our those involved in transport, those involved in private economy, and all of us in our homes. We need to make sure that we're doing every single thing possible to contribute to the overall reduction so that we can achieve our targets, and it's something that we, as I know you are, committed to doing.
Deputy Ken O'Flynn.
Thank you, Lachlan Corla. Minister, I want to raise with you an issue that has gone unaddressed for far too long in this House, a blatant discrimination built on the taxation regime, a discrimination targeted squarely at the citizens with no children in this country. I want to ask you plainly, is it acceptable for this government to oversee, implement and defend a taxation system that discriminates against people purely based on the fact that they do not have children? Every day in Ireland, those without children are treated as second-class citizens under the capital acquisitions tax regime, specifically in relation to inheritance tax. These individuals are prohibited by law from passing on the same value of their hard-earned, already taxed asset to loved ones as those without children, as those with children can. And why? Not because they've earned less, not because they have contributed less to society, but simply because they do not have children. In Budget 2025, Minister Chambers increased the threshold of Group A, B and C of inheritance tax brands, which may seem fair at looking at it, but the actuality is, considering what happened, if Group A, the parents with children, enjoy a larger tax-free inheritance without increase, the increases remain untouched for those without children. Let's imagine if the opposite had occurred, if Group A had been reduced to 40,000, Group B and C up to 400,000. We could picture the outrage on the streets of Ireland from those parents, and rightly so. But just because that would be deeply unfair. But the hypocrisy is when childless couples, citizens, face the reverse scenario, They're told to sit down, they're told to shut up and accept it, and that's it, that you're less deserving, that your relationship with your niece, your nephew, with siblings, with lifelong friends just simply don't count. Government response so far has centred around a minor threshold adjustment spread over time, but Minister, that does not reform, that does not justify, and that's certainly not equality. You can't fix a structural discrimination system with a few tweaks here and there of the job. So I say directly to you, Minister, is this equitable? That parents like yourself, Minister, with 2 children can leave up to €800,000 tax-free, where people like myself with no children, single persons, or people that cannot have children can leave 80,000 tax-free to loved ones. That's 10 times less. 10 times less, Minister. The system penalises the childless citizen of this country for the simple fact that they do not, or perhaps cannot, have children.
Minister.
Thank you, Deputy, and thank you for raising this matter. I know this is something that obviously impacts on a significant proportion of our population, and there's very different reasons why people may not have children, choose not to have children, can't have children, or in different scenarios where it doesn't happen. I suppose it is always the case, and it is always open to any individual or to group of people to make representations, be it prior to the budget, be it coming up to the budget, or any time of the year, to make representations to try and put forward changes to our taxation system, whether that's to inheritance tax or any other part of our tax system. And this is no different here, and I'm aware that there is a briefing due to take place, I think, next week on this particular matter, where many of the issues that you've outlined will be discussed and raised, and we as deputies have an opportunity to engage with and to listen to the various different challenges, the various different concerns and the issues that you've just outlined. And, you know, in what you're saying, there's absolute merit. The relationship that a parent has with their child is so often very similar to the relationship that a person has with their niece, with their nephew, or indeed with a close friend. And it's to make sure that our taxation system works for everybody, but also that there are clear lines, that there are strict rules, and that obviously they can be clearly followed. Of course, as a government, we've made changes to our inheritance tax system over the last number of years. I appreciate it doesn't apply to the scenarios that you're referencing. We have tried to make sure that where families are passing on, be it their home, be it their land, be it property that they have, that insofar as possible, as much of that goes directly to their children, to their family, so that they can plan for their future as well, because that's why so many of us invest in what we do. That's why so many of us work. It's to make sure that we can provide for and plan for our family and those closest to us. So obviously what you're suggesting here is that this would go broader than the immediate family unit as been set out. And I think really that's something that we as a Dáil, as colleagues, it's a discussion that can and should be had, but ultimately it's a decision that has to be taken within the budget, within parameters, and obviously that can be done prior to the budget. And I know that, as I said, there's a conversation due to take place in the AV room next week. Thank you.
Minister, this is not a hypothetical or abstract policy debate. This is literally thousands, hundreds of thousands of people in this country. On March 19th in the Upper House, Minister O'Donoghue said he would address this, the fundamental points of discrimination. He also made the statement that it seemed to be constitutional. Yet he has provided no proof, no legal argument, no documentation has ever been published by this government or previous governments to support that claim. Absolutely none. So I ask the government the following, and I hope you can respond with clarity and commitment on this. Do you believe that the current inheritance tax system is fair and equal in its treatment of childless citizens when comparing those to have children? Has the capital acquisition tax regime, the particular inheritance tax, been reviewed since 1991 to ensure the compliance with the equity status legislation? And will the government publish all documentation and supports that does not infringe the breach of the constitutional rights of the childless citizen? Minister, I have to point out to you, if I leave all my money to the dog's home pays absolutely zero tax. So therefore, the Chihuahua has more rights in this country than the childless citizen, or my niece or my nephew.
Thank you, Deputy. Do you know, I think our job in this stall is to make sure that any of the rules that we adhere to and abide by, any of our taxation measures, that they're as fair as possible. I think that's our job here, to make sure that anything that we put in place, that it's fair and that it's applicable to all citizens. And I think it's about understanding, I suppose, what the potential implications are here, what the measures would need to be taken, what the overall costs would be. The Minister, I believe, has said that this is something that can be discussed or is open to discussing as part of the overall budget conversation, because that's where it has to come from. And I appreciate your point. This is more than a budget conversation or a taxation measure. We're talking about people's lives. And I certainly don't think that a dog's life is worth more, or that should be in a better position than a young person, a niece or a nephew, as you've mentioned. So I think this is about all of us collectively looking at our rules. How do we make them more equitable? How do we make them fair? How do we make them apply equally? But we have to do so within the parameters and the context that are available to us. And as I said, I'm very aware and sure that the Minister is open to doing that.
Minister. We now take the question under other members' questions.